Picture this. You are a soldier fighting for the grand old US of A in World War II. You are hunkered down in a trench when a mortar shell lands a short distance away. Bang! Where's your arm? Nobody knows. Oh, wait, there it is, 20 feet away from you. That sucks. Well, on with life, I guess. Yeah, that's not exactly how the situation ends. You won't feel anything in the current moments because of the adrenaline coursing through your veins, but that'll wear off eventually. And what happens after that? Well, since your arm is lying in the mud 20 feet to your left, it's safe to say we can forget about reattaching it. Even in modern times, a process of reattaching a limb has to occur within hours of its severance from your body, or else it won't work. That's ignoring that this one's covered in mud and the line of severance is far from a clean cut. Assuming that you can find proper medical treatment, you have a decent chance at living on, just without one of your main limbs. But how does one function without an arm? Or any lost limb for that matter? Despite what those videos on TikTok show, living without one or multiple limbs isn't exactly ideal. Luckily, there is a whole subject of science just for replacing your lost branch. Well, sort of. Prosthetics are a mechanical engineer's solution to that problem, and I will be briefly going over the evolution of this topic over the years. In the case of people with lost limbs, prosthetics are a way to gain a lot of their independence back. If it wasn't clear to you before, losing a limb is a life-altering experience and it takes some getting used to. Prosthetics are not the end-all be-all solution, however, as we can see from these early examples. That's a prosthetic. Yes, my friends, that's a beautifully crafted Egyptian big toe. Ignore the exposed mummified dogs. This is called the Cairo toe and is believed to be the first ever functional fake body part. It is estimated to be around 3,000 years old and might have belonged to the daughter of a high-status Egyptian priest. The Cairo toe was found on the remains of a woman, was made out of leather and wood, and was thought to be quite comfy compared to some alternative options at the time. This, however, is possibly predated by another artifact, as another toe has been documented. This one, called the Egyptian cartonnage toe, predates the Cairo toe by at most 200 years, and is instead crafted out of paper mache, made from linen, glue, and plaster. It is questionable to which one came first, as the possible age of both of the toes can be represented by this lovely graph pictured here. Regardless, they both line up around the same time period and represent the first ever prosthetic limbs known to the modern era. We can see from those examples that early prosthetics were kind of crude to say the least. They probably weren't the first thing that came to your mind when you imagined a prosthetic, and are a far shot from modern prosthetics used today. There are many more examples of early prosthetics lost to time that have likely disintegrated. The only other records I was able to find of ancient prosthetics were those only recorded in text. For example, the records of the historian Herodotus tells the experience of a Persian diviner, I'm not pronouncing that,
Hegesistratus,
who after getting imprisoned by the Spartans, cuts off his own foot to free himself from the shackles and replaces it with a wooden prosthetic. There isn't a lot of info on such cases though, so let's move on to some interesting stuff. It was a Renaissance time period when the Germans decided to drop this absolute beauty for us. This is the iron hand of German knight Gotz von... I'm not pronouncing that. What is up with these names?
Götz von Berlichingen.
This masterpiece of German engineering was fashioned with flexible fingies for our lovely knight after he lost his hand in the siege of Landshut in the year 1505. The flexible digits were fashioned so that he could bend his artificial fingers passively where they could be locked into position through the use of an internal mechanism. This allowed him to hold objects such as the reins of his horse, various weapons, and even a quill as to write. Before this mechanical marvel,
Götz von Berlichingen
had a simpler glove-like prosthetic developed for his use. This one was made from iron and leather, and mustn't have worked very well as he quickly replaced it with the previously discussed full iron counterpart. One of the most famous examples of prosthetics that literally everybody and their grandma has heard of is pirates. Pirates are almost always portrayed as having prosthetic limbs, when in reality, prosthetics were more than likely added as a scare factor in TV shows and books written after the golden age of piracy. Other theories suggest that peg legs and other pirate prosthetics were added to influence young males on proper manliness, where a pirate captain regained his mobility through the use of a fake leg, instead of being disabled and a burden to others. Yeah, that would not slide today. This makes more sense though when understanding the common beliefs surrounding amputations at that time period. Many people of that time, when faced with the decision between an amputation and death, would take death. Kinda weird to think about, isn't it? Even though the history behind prosthetic using pirates is blurry, they still aren't a great example of the proper technology behind prosthetics for that time period. Prosthetics in the 1600s were going through a revolution thanks to a man by the name of Ambroise Paré. Ambroise Paré was what they called a barber surgeon. Apparently in those times, surgery was so rare that the only people that had sharp enough tools to perform it were barbers. Luckily, Paré was also an anatomist who knew quite a bit about the human body. He was reportedly the first surgeon, of sorts, to work alongside the people making prosthetics. This allowed him to help design prosthetics that may have been heavy and crude, but resemble closely to modern-day counterparts. Paré also made huge advances in the study of amputations, suggesting sites on the body that worked best for the process. This is why Ambroise Paré is commonly referred to as the founder of modern principles of amputations. There was another notable change that occurred about 100 years earlier that you might have picked up on. The last two examples were largely focused around the functionality of the prosthetic, rather than the looks. Before the year 1500, prosthetics were largely used to cover up an injury instead of replacing the functionality lost. As the methods used to manufacture prosthetics improved, so did the functionality. In ancient times, there wasn't a really good way to make any prosthetic, so instead of trying to make a replacement arm, humans in those times just focused on making the victim of a lost limb look semi-normal again. This is originally where the negative attitude directed at amputees and amputations in general began. It wasn't until the 1500s when we started to see the shift towards functionality in prosthetics. That's why I stated before that amputees in the age of pirates were looked at as a burden. It's not easy to live and work a regular job without one of your limbs, so many of them kinda just wrote off others. That is why we start to see a shift in attitude at this time period towards making prosthetics available to those who have a lost limb and lightening the attitude surrounding the topic. World War I was the first time in human history where prosthetics were needed in large quantities. Soldiers were not only dying in conflict, but many were coming home without limbs. World War I introduced mass production into the world of prosthetics because of the immense demand. You see, before this, prosthetics could take months or even years to get working properly because of the wide variety of jobs the patients were occupying. Each prosthetic had to be specifically tailored to that amputee's occupation, and it took several iterations to get most prosthetics to function correctly. Unfortunately, with so many people losing limbs in the war, this process needed to be refined. World War I not only introduced the mass manufacturing of prosthetics, but the individualization of the amputees themselves. Prosthetics of this time were entering a new era where each case was still being looked at individually to respect the occupation of the patient, but the process of manufacturing the prosthetic was being standardized. This led to the creation of many prosthetic-based companies fighting to create a mass manufacturable, yet versatile design to fit the amputees of the First World War. It's safe to say that this market drove the research and development of prosthetics to a whole new level. Everybody was experimenting with new designs, with new materials, in an attempt to gain an edge in a fiercely competitive market. The ultimate goal behind all these companies was to gain a coveted partnership with the US War Department itself. However, business was also available across seas through international aid organizations, who helped soldiers all around the world with war-related injuries. The design of prosthetics through World War II remained largely unchanged from those in World War I. The drive and research behind the topic fueled by the competitive market still existed, but for the wrong reasons. Instead of trying to create the best prosthetic that provided the best function, user experience, and comfort, companies were trying to create a prosthetic that still functioned, but the focus was more on lowering the cost as much as possible. To get a prosthetic limb after being wounded in the war was a bit underwhelming considering the sacrifice these soldiers gave. Upon leaving the war, a now veteran amputee would receive a temporary prosthetic from the government, and would then be referred to the Veterans Administration for a more permanent solution. The Veterans Administration would then prescribe their patient a limb from one of the previously mentioned companies, which company was decided by who was the cheapest. This system was an absolute disgrace to the veterans that gave their entire original way of life away. just to be treated like any other citizen, even less. Obviously, the veterans were not satisfied by this service and organized a march at the Capitol in 1945. In response, the Veterans Administration would centralize their prosthetics operation, and Congress would grant the Veterans Administration more flexibility in the prosthetics they could provide. After the war ended, the entire process was refined even more in 1947 and 1948 through the passing of new legislation, a mandated annual budget, and the foundation of the Prosthetics and Sensory Aid Services, or PSAS. All of these changes allowed for the rapid government-funded research and development of prosthetics designed around comfort and function instead of cost. Modern-day prosthetics are focused much more on functionality than looks. Today's prostheticists are using much more advanced materials such as aluminum, carbon fiber, titanium, and silicone. Long gone are the days of wood and heavy metals. In modern times, prosthetics are designed to be as light as possible while still being durable enough to last. Today's prosthetics are designed to replace the lost limbs function, which is proven successful by the fact that most mid-calf amputees can now walk without any noticeable limp and are able to participate in most recreational sports and activities. Leg prosthetics have seen the most functional improvement over the years, as the job of a leg is way easier to replicate than an arm. Modern leg prosthetics are at a point where, in most cases, they can almost entirely replace the lost function of a leg, and hey, with a prosthetic, you don't have to worry about rolling your ankle anymore. Modern arm prosthetics have taken a different direction, splitting into two main categories: body-powered and motorized. Body-powered prosthetics are prosthetics that move with a cable system, typically attached to the back of the shoulder. This typically only allows 1 degree of motion at a time. The 1 degree of motion is typically taken up by the prosthetic hand or hook located on the end of the arm. Motorized arm prosthetics contain, well, you guessed it, motors. These motors control the movements of the arm using signals from a central microcontroller. Motorized arm prosthetics can be myoelectric, which use the EMG signals from residual muscles left from the amputation to function and control different parts and functions of the prosthetic arm. The downside to such devices is the fact that they are extremely unintuitive to use reliably, because the muscles used to contract the bicep, or any muscle in that case, are essentially rebound to control a random feature of the myoelectric arm. It's extremely hard to just rewire your brain in such a way, which is the reason why so many people just give up trying to learn how to use them. As you have hopefully learned from this video, prosthetics are still a changing science. Innovations are happening every year, and the future is inevitably going to hold much more for the evolution of this topic. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and hey, maybe you learned something. Thanks for watching.